Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this session. My name is Dr. John Adenitire. I am a strategic lecturer at the University of Queen Mary, University of London, and I'm a fellow in the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences. And today we are delighted to host a book launch of Dr. Stefan Theil, who is currently at Cambridge. There he is the John Turley Fellow in Law at Sydney Sussex College, and I am so pleased to have him with us because Stefan and I were more or less at the same time at Cambridge as PhD students, though he was in the year above me. So it's great to have some ex-colleague joining us here. And he is here to talk about his book, this very interesting book called Towards the Environmental Minimum, which he published, I understand, just last year, and is the revised version of his doctoral work, and is published by Cambridge University Press and sold in every good bookshop, and which should be purchased not just by institutional libraries but by individuals as well. Okay, and today we have a panel composed by, you can already see Dr. Andrew Russo, who is a lecturer in environmental science at in the School of Geography at Queen Mary, and he joined in October. Before being at Queen Mary, he worked in the civil service, and he was a senior lecturer at Brunel University, London. Okay, then we have Dr. Tibisay Morgandi, who is a lecturer in International Energy and Natural Resources Law here at Queen Mary in the Center for Commercial Law Studies. And as chair of the session, though we are having some technical difficulties now, we have Professor Simon Reid Henry, who hopefully will be joining us soon. And he is, of course, the director of the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. So in terms of today, the way that we are going to operate is we're going to have Dr. Stefan Theil present the outline of his book for the first 5 to 10 minutes, and then progressively panelists Dr. Andrew Russo, and I can see that Dr. Tibisay is joining us now, and myself will respond to Stefan's ideas in his book, and perhaps we will have some time for Stefan to give us a short reply to the comments, and finally we will have some questions, Q&A from attendees, from the larger public. Hopefully by then we will have Professor Simon Reid Henry join us to chair that. If not, I will do the honors. Okay, thank you all, and let's have Stefan start. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, John, for that very generous introduction, and thank you everyone at Queen Mary, and especially the Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences for hosting me today, and obviously a big thank you to Andrew, to John, to Tibisay, and to Simon when he does actually end up joining us. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, and I hope John is going to give me a wave or something when I'm going over time, as I have a habit of doing. Thanks, John. Just to give you an outline, I'm going to do a little whistle-stop tour of the book, some of the main themes, some of the main things that I think come out of the book or that I try to make the argument for in the book. And then I'm going to raise a question here or there against the backdrop of climate change, just think through some of the issues and some of the implications that might flow from that. Great, so the book in a nutshell. So essentially, one of the main ideas that I'm addressing, or one of the main issues I'm addressing in the book, is that pervasive environmental harm disproportionately impacting vulnerable populations across the world, and it's left largely unregulated, despite existing commitments to human rights and environmental protection that many states have signed up to. So in order to address this shortcoming, what the book does is it proposes a normative framework, in law that allows judicial decision makers that allows regulators to think through these issues of environmental protection in the context of human rights protection and human rights law. I try to do this by adopting a human rights-centered approach that doesn't require, in my view, radical departures from established protection regimes and legal principles already well established in law. This framework ultimately I call the environmental minimum, and it tries to translate the abstract and general commitments that we find in international and domestic law into specific and practical measures that regulators, judicial decision makers, and others can ultimately make sense of. It tries to develop this in a way that is attuned to the doctrine of international, regional, and domestic courts, and it tries to do this in line with existing, with empirical data that I gathered for this book. And by empirical data, I don't mean interviews, I mean gathering data on judgments, the prevalence of judgments, the outcomes, and how they were decided over time. I focus on a couple of select jurisdictions, but the main focus is on the European Convention on Human Rights. The first, and I guess most important argument that I try to make in the book is that human rights have to, as a matter of philosophy and as a matter of legal theory, they must contain a subcategory of rights that provide protections from environmental harm. And this is so, I argue, because environmental human rights recognize that there is degradation and pollution around the world that threatens the enjoyment and hence ultimately the fundamental commitments that underpin all of our human rights. So there's a lot of potential candidates out there, things that we think give value and give us reasons to protect human rights: autonomy, human dignity, perhaps even certain utilitarian considerations come into play here. That doesn't really matter to me as much as just noting that all human rights seem to presuppose an environmental conditions of a certain quality. If those don't exist, then it's very difficult to see how you can meaningfully enjoy a right to life, a right to protest, a right to free expression. All of these presume certain fundamental environmental characteristics. And that being the case, I think we should recognize and protect certain fundamental environmental conditions. Now, I accomplished this, as I said, through the framework of the environmental minimum, and that framework has several distinct elements that I now want to briefly address. Again, I can give you a more comprehensive overview towards the end, and I can go into more details if that is of interest, but I'm just going to leave it at a whistle-stop tour, as I indicated. So first of all, we require, under the environmental minimum framework, a specific risk. Now, a specific risk is where there's a reasonable hypothesis based on scientific evidence that links a certain environmental harm to a threat towards a specific human right. Now, this specific risk standard is designed to act as a preliminary filter that excludes from consideration certain environmental harms that either do not threaten any established human rights or that have an insufficient basis in science. So an example of an insufficient basis in science are, I think, recurring but ultimately not well substantiated claims that fluoridation of drinking water is a threat to human health. A lot of people claim that it is, but there's no real good science there, so that would not count as a specific risk under the environmental minimum framework. Once we have a specific risk, we need to see whether that specific risk falls short of an established minimum standard, hence the word environmental minimum. So there are three types of minimum standards that I identify, and each of them carry with them different implications for law and regulation. So the first and most important one are the legal standards. Now, those are the standards that we find in domestic and international law that has already been enacted. So they're already in force, in other words. They require the state to regulate a certain environmental harm in a certain way and in line with fundamental commitments to the rule of law and in international law, the principle of pacta sunt servanda. This is directly binding on states in a very direct, in a very meaningful way. The only exception here is that if a state adopts a legal standard in bad faith. So for instance, if a state adopts a legal standard that clearly falls short of what accepted scientific evidence would say is a safe level. So for instance, we can imagine cyanide in drinking water, for instance. If a state adopts a regulation that proposes a level of cyanide in drinking water that is clearly lethal or detrimental to health, then we would assume that that is a standard adopted in bad faith. There's other indicators of bad faith, and they include retrogression. So for instance, if a higher level of environmental protection was available at the state through legislation amends that level of protection in a way that favors polluting industries, for instance, then again, we would assume, barring other strong evidence, that this is an example of bad faith. In the absence of legal standards, so let's imagine an environmental issue is not regulated at all by any sort of regulation, then the established standards apply. Now, these established standards draw on the accepted scientific evidence in the relevant scientific community. So for instance, by experts at international organizations like the World Health Organization, because they compile, weigh, and evaluate evidence in a more systematic way over longer periods of time to arrive at their recommendations. Now, if the environmental harm exceeds those established standards, then again, there would be an issue under the environmental minimum framework. Finally, if there are neither legal standards nor established standards, we fall back onto the final category, which is emerging standards. Now, emerging standards generally point out to us that there's no consensus in the relevant scientific community on an environmental harm. So in that case, it was the regulators are left with a considerable margin of appreciation to figure out how they want to respond to the environmental issue. So how does this all relate? This environmental minimum standard relate to the precautionary principle. Now, precautionary principle is a concept within international environmental law that essentially says that when there are questions about environmental harm and degradation put forward, then states should adopt a precautionary approach, which essentially means that they should, when in doubt, prohibit risky behavior. Now, the environmental minimum is related to the precautionary principle in the sense that it also deals with the regulation of risk, but it is very different in some important respects. So whereas the precautionary principle can, I think, rightly be criticized for making partially simplistic and partially simply unobjectionable claims, there is a level of incoherence in the principle that I think ultimately defeats it having a decisive impact in many situations. And that is because it always requires specification. The precautionary principle always invites us to ask, well, precautionary with respect to what risk exactly? And in some cases that is clarified within the instrument that is being discussed, and then that's usually fine. In other contexts, it's just a general principle applied in a blanket way across, for instance, a body of law, as in an EU law, for instance. And there, I think it is ultimately less useful. I can get into the detail as to why I think that, if that is of interest. Should we object to the adjudication of human rights law when it comes to environmental rights, specifically because it's the courts that are involved? I argue that we shouldn't. I think the strongest argument to caution us against judicial intervention is polycentricity. But I think that ultimately that does not defeat the adjudication of environmental issues through human rights law and through courts specifically. And that is because I think that polycentricity ultimately identifies a pervasive feature that is true of everything in the legal world. So there's no mode of decision-making that is somehow less susceptible to the issues that polycentricity and that law fuller identifies as being problematic for courts. Finally, why did I focus on the ECHR? Well, simply said, there's a couple of reasons for this, but one of the most important ones is just a lot of data there. So unbeknownst to many people who end up writing about these matters in scholarship and legal scholarship, especially, there's over 350 environmentally themed cases and decisions under the ECHR that have been decided and amount to approximately 12.8 environmentally themed applications and about 10 decisions every year between 1985 and 2014. How do I know that? Well, because I actually trawled through all of them for you and compiled a massive data set that records important information about all of them. So first of all, it's just simply a numbers game. The ECHR offers us a whole massive body of cases. Secondly, the ECHR is relevant to 47 separate jurisdictions in Europe that already, at least on paper, claim to uphold quite high environmental standards. So one of the questions that the ECHR allows us to answer is, what could a human rights-based approach to environmental protection possibly offer us in addition to the already, quote unquote, quite high protection available across Europe? Third, and finally, I think the domestic interpretation, in terms of domestic interpretation, the ECHR is also quite relevant. How do we interpret rights? How do we understand rights? There's an evolution there. It's part of an evolution of European fundamental rights protection. And as such, what the ECHR deems permissible might also well be permissible in domestic jurisdictions and hence help us enhance the overall protection. I can talk a bit later on about what implications I think the framework has for climate change if that's of interest, but for now, since I'm running out of time, I'm going to pass it back to John.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan, for that tour de force through your book. And yes, we look forward to discussing it in the sessions to come. I am told that Simon unfortunately cannot join us for technical reasons, so the chairing of the session falls to me. I'll be both a chair and panelist. So now I have my chairing hat on, and later on I'll be a panelist. So in my capacity as chair, we will go in this order. We'll first have Tibisay, and then Andrew, and then myself as panelist, and then Stefan will respond if he wishes to any points that the panelists have raised, and then we'll have some Q&A, which with the attendees, which I will chair. Okay, so I think I introduced everyone at the beginning, so we can just go straight to our panelists. So Tibisay, up to you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Stefan, for this very concise and compressed, in a way, introduction. There is a lot in your book, and I have read it with great pleasure. I think for a start, I would like to praise you for the title. I think it's a very catchy title. And when I saw it, I was thinking environmental minimum. And what about an environmental maximum? Why are we still talking about a minimum? Why, after decades of environmental regulation, we're still talking just about a minimum? And perhaps you can elaborate on why you decided to select this title, which I think is extremely attractive because it shows to what extent we still are falling short of protecting the environment as, one of our priorities. Digging into some of the elements that you have discussed in this brief presentation, but also in your book, which I strongly encourage people to read, because you really get an overall sense only when you get to see the book of all the work that Stefan has done. And it's very impressive, as he was saying, is even this data set, it's really quite an impressive work that he has put together. I really like this idea of creating a novel normative framework to look at the relationship between human rights and environmental protection. Now, looking at environmental protection as a subcategory of human rights is obviously, perhaps one of the ways to look at how to protect the environment. Whenever something which amounts to environmental harm also amounts to a violation of a human right that is protected under a regional framework or under domestic law, then we have a synergy. And therefore, we can say that that environmental harm, because it also amounts to a violation of protected human right, can, to some extent be addressed, and there may be, a form of redress for that kind of harm. However, I was thinking, what about all the situations in which we have environmental harm, which do not amount to a violation of protected human right? And obviously, we have very developed frameworks around the world. We have, as you were mentioning, the European Convention on Human Rights, which, as you were saying, is the most developed framework. But we also have the American Convention on Human Rights, the African Charter. But what about those regions of the world that don't have these regional frameworks? There, we even fall short of being able to protect the environment under the umbrella of human rights. Obviously, you have looked also at domestic law, and I really like, the fact that you look at some very developed domestic frameworks. But I wonder whether you find that to some extent, we are still trying to, in a way, build a framework to fill a gap in international law, because we have failed to protect the environment somehow else. Now, there are other frameworks which you analyze, and there are frameworks under climate change. We have obviously, 3 important treaties: the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, which directly look at greenhouse gases emission, climate change, global warming, and all these consequences. But I wonder how you feel about these and whether you could, elaborate whether these framework could be somehow translated in contexts where human rights may be protected at the domestic level, but are not protected at the regional level, or contexts where they are not even protected at the domestic level, and whether we can export this concept of environmental minimum in different jurisdictions, in different contexts. Perhaps something else that I can add, I very much like, these discussion that you were getting into now on the precautionary principle, and this idea that we are only ready to protect the environment when there is at least some level of scientific certainty. Now, as you said, there are national, regional, and international frameworks which anyway promote precaution. Even if there is not scientific certainty, we think the risk is so high that we might take measures. And we've seen also in the case law, some tribunals are much more progressive and really give some weight and operationalize the precautionary principle. Other tribunals are reluctant and they say, well, we will be prohibiting every kind of human activity if we really were to use a very high threshold. We need some level of scientific certainty. So I wonder where this environmental minimum stands in this relationship between prevention and precaution. Is it the environmental minimum fits only within prevention, which is when we have scientific certainty? Or is it that in the environmental minimum, if we look at what you call emerging standards, so those standards that are still developing and somehow reflect precaution, can actually develop, via this emerging standard. And, whenever we see that even in a particular, let's think of, some islands that are facing the sea level rise and they are much more at risk than other regions of the world, because, climate change can have really serious effect on them. Are we in a context in which precaution is actually the right approach, and then our environmental minimum is tweaked according, to the specific needs? So these are just some ideas, but I really want to congratulate you. It's a fantastic book, and I had a lot of pleasure in reading it. It's also very accessible, I think, for people who are not specialists in the field and non-lawyers, although, perhaps I'm a bit biased here because I am also an international lawyer, but I found it very well written and very comprehensive. So congratulations, Stefan, and I look forward to your answers.
Okay, thank you so much, Tibisay, for that. That was exemplary timekeeping, even, and exemplary contributions and questions, of course. So thank you for that contribution. So we'll move swiftly to Dr. Andrew Russo, who I've introduced at the beginning of the session. And over to you now, Andrew.
Great, thank you, John. And thank you to Stefan for writing the book and giving me a look at what's in there. So my background is not international law. I'm a physical scientist by training. So about 5 years ago, that was all I'd ever done was climate change modeling, statistical analyses of climate change and health and those sorts of things. And then I decided that I wanted to see what happened to all my work and all my colleagues' work, and joined the civil service to look at how science feeds into policy in that way. And I think a lot of what I did in one of my roles was a sort of logical approach to what you were doing from a legal approach in the book. So my role at the Committee on Climate Change, our key responsibilities there were to contribute an evidence report for the climate change risk assessment, the UK climate change risk assessment. So we were identifying what all the risks were and trying to rank them in some way so that government could then develop a response within their national adaptation programme, which has always been inadequate. And we know it's inadequate because the other job of the Committee on Climate Change is to produce a biennial statutory progress report assessing UK policies in response to the climate risks that we face. So through a lot of that work, we were, I don't know, maybe trying to reinvent the wheel of things that you already knew about, Stefan, from a sort of logical point of view. And what I wanted to do in the few minutes that I'm going to talk here is mention some of the ways that we tried to apply these sorts of ideas and some of the problems we faced, and then think a little bit about the future and climate change in particular. So I think I'm a little bit older than some of you in the panel. I started my PhD 20 years ago, so I've been interested and seen a lot of the developments around the international climate change negotiations, even though for a long time I knew very little about that. So I thought it'd be interesting taking a step back and thinking about what this environmental minimum would be within a climate change context and how the kind of standard, the target we're aiming for, developed a little bit. So, I mean, today we know a lot about 1.5. COP26 was all about keeping 1.5 alive. But if we look further back to 1992, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed, that doesn't mention 2 degrees anywhere in there. The target there was to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. The 2 degrees target didn't really come about until 1996, when there was a European Council of Environment Ministers meeting, where Angela Merkel was present as the Environment Minister of Germany, and John Gummer was the Environment Minister of the UK, who is now known as Lord Deben and is chair of the Committee on Climate Change. So some of these people have stuck around for a long time in this field. So that's really where the 2 degrees target came up. And I have no idea why 2 degrees was set. I still don't have a good idea why. I think this is where it becomes really difficult, this idea of setting a target, because climate change, the actual impacts, the damage that it will do to society comes from, how shall I put this, the acute problems that come from the systemic problem of climate change. So you try and measure this change in the system, the systemic problem, with this proxy of 2 degrees, and then translate that into dangerous anthropogenic interference in things like heat waves or floods or water shortages or crop failures and so on. So 2 degrees was informally the UNFCCC target for a long time. And I think around 2010, 2011, either, what was it, Cancun or Copenhagen. I think it was written into the accord at Copenhagen, but that wasn't formally accepted at the COP. But by Cancun it was. So then 2 degrees is our target. But that all changes in 2016 when we have the Paris Agreement, where we're now looking to keep global warming well below 2 degrees, whilst pursuing efforts to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. Now, this is where it gets interesting as well, in that the UNFCCC has never defined what pre-industrial temperatures are. Neither has the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that produces the assessments that feed into the UNFCCC. In fact, the IPCC is very, very careful to never call their reference period of 1850 to 1900 pre-industrial temperatures. So it's assumed by everyone that we can read 1850 to 1900 as pre-industrial temperatures. But there's this big problem in the whole thing, that the IPCC and the UNFCCC have different definitions of what pre-industrial temperatures are, and no one has really determined what that is, let alone the calculation of what global warming actually is. It's 1.1 using the IPCC method. It's different using the World Meteorological Organization method. So that there are issues here in applying these sorts of ideas, which are not insurmountable. But this has taken from 1992 to 2016 to get to a point where we've decided on something which is pretty inadequate, actually, as a target. But then I think that cascades out into, well, maybe climate change isn't the thing that we should be looking at, and it's the acute problems that exacerbates. So things like flooding, which is something that I have a lot of experience looking at in the UK in the policy context. So what I was really interested in my time at the Committee on Climate Change was, what are we actually trying to achieve with the huge investments that we make in flood risk management? So the current settlement period has assigned £5.2 billion to flood risk management for the next 6 years, so out to 2027. And the main target there is to better protect 336,000 homes. That target doesn't say which 336,000 homes, how much better they'll be protected, or why it was 336,000 homes. I mean, I'm being deliberately obtuse up to a point, and there is an algorithm behind this, how those funds are allocated. But we do have the numbers, the analysis of risk in the UK, to be able to look at the risk faced by every home and then develop some much bigger strategy about what we want to achieve. And the National Infrastructure Commission tried doing this. They tried setting resilience standards. So saying that everyone in the UK should be resilient to a flood risk of, a 0.5% chance of flooding in any given year. So a 1 in 200 year event. Now, applying that becomes a bit difficult because in some places, urban areas where there's high population density, spending a lot of money building a concrete wall and stopping the water getting in is efficient. You'll get a return on your investment, and the cost benefit analysis works out. If you're looking at isolated homes that are subject to surface water flooding, so flash flooding, then it's not cost effective to build big walls. So then you want to start thinking about property level protection and those sorts of approaches. So we can just about do that for flooding because we can calculate the risk because it's a physical system. We know the hydrology, we know the climate change, we can look at the solutions, and we can put the two together and see what we need to do to potentially reach an environmental standard. One problem that I always had with that approach is that it works for flooding. We could spend a load of money and do that, but then other risks we can't quantify quite so easily. So the risks of new pests and diseases coming into the UK, a heat wave risk, the vulnerability plays a lot more of a key there rather than the temperature extremes. So that would be an almost impossible calculation to work out what your environmental or your protection standard should be there. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, and I think we do need to think about this and calculate risk much better and try and work out what we want to do to address the increasing risks that we will see as a result of climate change. So yeah, I think your book raises a lot of really important questions, and I think if you submitted like a policy note to the Committee on Climate Change or DEFRA or something like that, and we could have a workshop or something and work out how these things would all fit together, I think that would be a brilliant idea. And yeah, getting the essence of your idea out of the legal world and into the sort of risk assessment, the engineering adaptation world for climate change, at least, I think that would be brilliant. So I will stop there and hand back to John.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really helpful. And to remind everyone that, of course, the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences tries to do what we have just done now, bring different individuals from different disciplines into conversation about important issues, including, of course, the environment and climate change. Okay, so that's me in terms of my chair. I now put on my hat on as a panelist, and for the next 10 minutes or so, I shall be responding to Stefan's very insightful book. So I, of course, in any of these events, we always have to start by acknowledging Stefan's work, yes, because it's always a bigger effort to publish a book, especially your first book. I know, and it takes a lot of dedication and single-mindedness to be able to do that, and to do that so well as you have done here. So congratulations to you. But as we are in academia, and the best compliment that academics can give to each other is engagement, right, rather than merely praise, even critical engagement. So I'll try to give you that form of praise as much as I can here by critically engaging with your work. So in terms of critically engaging with your work, I think the strength of your book is also its weakness. So the strength is, of course, is conservatism. The fact that you try to bring into operation a concern for environmental rights based on existing paradigms. So you use the existing paradigm of human rights. You focus on one of the most, if not the most successful international court, which is the European Court of Human Rights. Of course, it's not the only one, but it's the one whose judgments are being mostly complied with, successful in that term. And of course, successful also in terms of its geographical reach across Europe and is in influence across the globe. And so you, in this conservatism that you have, your hope is that by showing that the environmental minimum is respected, at least to a certain degree, in the jurisprudence of the ECHR, as well as, of course, you point out to certain other courts, then it is more easily operationalized. Yes, so you're not a revolutionary, you're a conservative. You want things, you're a realist, I would say. You want things to work. And in fact, you show that they do already work to a large extent, especially in the ECHR, that the ECHR adopts to a large extent your environmental minimum. And so, the ECHR and those can lead the charge for the regional and domestic courts in operationalizing the environmental minimum. So, of course, that's his strength, the fact that it's feasible, the feasibility of your book. Of course, the fact that it's feasible doesn't mean that that it will be put into action everywhere, but so that there is, of course, a lot of effort that you expend on that issue. So that's to the strength of the project, but his strength is also his weakness, because you build your project on what I would call, for this purpose, the cult of human rights, or in less dramatic terms, you have a very anthropocentric view, right? So you you argue for environmental protection and safety from environmental harms for the benefit of humans, right? That's why that's why you talk about environmental human rights. And the case you make a dignity and autonomy, human dignity and human autonomy rationale, mostly. You talk about other reasons as well for protecting this the environmental minimum, but you focus on the human dignity and human autonomy as rationale for the environmental minimum. However, the anthropocentrism of your book is, I would argue, part of the problem. The fact that we need, and Tibisay said this very, very strongly at the beginning of our talk, why we still talking about the minimum, right? We should be trying to find more radical ideas. Of course, we want them to be operationalized, but we cannot keep going as business as usual. We need something more radical. And I come from the perspective of writing on animal rights, And I think we need to move beyond an anthropocentric approach to an approach where we recognize that environmental harm should be prohibited or should be limited and regulated, not only when it harms humans, but also because it harms, of course, the environment itself, but also other sentient beings that are valuable in themselves. So when it harms other non-human animals, especially sentient ones that can feel pain and are harmed. Your rationale that is based on dignity and that is based on autonomy actually does not only apply to humans, right? So your anthropocentrism, which you justify by these principles of dignity and autonomy, actually, if we take those principles seriously, they apply to animals as well. So take the case of dignity, which the law of some jurisdictions, at least, so Switzerland, India, recognizes that animals have dignity, right? And in your book, you make the case a well-being analysis of dignity, which is quite unusual in the philosophical literature. But in any event, you say that humans, as an aspect of dignity, need to have access to soil, food, clean water, non-toxic care, right? Well, in order to have their dignity preserved. But the same need to access clean water, clean air, good soil is equally applicable to non-human animals. You also make a rationality autonomy case, for the environmental human rights. But autonomy, again, is not a preserve of humans. Even if we take a quasi-Kantian idea of autonomy, which is very cognitively ableist, which requires very high cognitive abilities, certain humans wouldn't be able to reach those high expectations of Kantian autonomy. But more fundamentally, certain animals may be able to reach those higher expectations. So in terms of humans that couldn't reach those higher expectations, we could take infants or in humans with severe cognitive inabilities. And in terms of animals, non-human animals that could reach that threshold, we could take, great apes, some cetaceans, maybe some dolphins, some orcas, animals that have very high cognitive abilities and that may be able to satisfy even a Kantian notion of autonomy. So it seems to me that the problem that we have with the environmental minimum is focused on anthropocentrism. And this is actually perhaps the initial cause of our environmental malaise, right? The fact that we see nature and other sentient animals as resources to be exploited for human uses. So take, for example, factory farming. We have trillions of animals being killed every year for human use. And this is usually just for nutrition. Yet factory farming is the leading cause of environmental degradation, deforestation, soil erosion, species extinction, and I could go on. So in terms of environmental harms, our abuse of fellow earthlings, of other sentient animals, is the principal cause of why we're here in the first place, why we need environmental regulation. And of course, now all our priorities are on climate change, but of course, animal agriculture is also a leading contributor to climate change. I think FAO says something like 14 to 15% of greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to animal husbandry. And the statistics are even more imperative when we take into consideration methane, which is a more potent gas, at least in the shorter term. And so if we want to reach our short-term goals of the Paris Agreement, whichever they are, whether 2 degrees or 1.5, methane, cutting down on methane emissions is a priority. So anyway, so you can see then that the instrumentalization of what we have called nature or the environment, or, but in my specific case, other individuals, even though not humans, leads us to the situation where we are asking for environmental regulation. But there's no way that, given that anthropocentrism, that we can find the cure in the same place where we have the disease. The cure cannot be given by the disease. So if anthropocentrism is a leading cause of the disease, anthropocentrism cannot be the cure. A cult of human rights cannot be the cure. Of course, it can be partially a cure, but we need more radical understandings, more radical frameworks in order to cure our environmental malaise. Okay, so I'll leave it at that, and I now take back my hat as the chair, and I know that Dr. Tibisay Morgandi will be leaving us in a few minutes, so this is just a warning to the attendees, a notice to the attendees. Perhaps, Stefan, you want to reply to the contributors, and if you could perhaps respond to Tibisay's contribution first, so that maybe she may have some time to reply if she can. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John, and thank you for everyone for those comments. I think that was really helpful, and it's giving me a lot to think about, especially as I think about follow-up publications from this one, which is always a good place to be in. TBC, thank you so much for your comments. Why are we still talking about the minimum? Because we've done a crappy job so far. I think that's the unfortunate conclusion. I think whether I'll get to those comments from John in a second, but whether we think of it as a human-centric, human ecocentrical endeavor, or whether we think of it as a benevolent endeavor to save all life on this planet, I think ultimately we've done a pretty bad job in most respects. The environment is and continues to be seen by many people historically, but also currently, as a resource for exploitation and not something that is valued or preserved or should be preserved for its own sake. So that's the unfortunate conclusion. That's why we still need to talk about it, because unfortunately there are many people still out there, and not just in law, but also in broader policy areas and elsewhere, who can't conceptualize it beyond that. And I think that's a big problem that we need to address. And I think to an extent it can be done through law. Obviously, law is not the silver bullet. It's not going to fix all our problems, and certainly human rights won't. But yes, unfortunately, that's why I still felt compelled to write about the minimum, as opposed to sketching perhaps a nicer view of a, not utopian, but a good environment to live in the future. What other comments do I feel like I can comment on now? Yeah, so there will be a lot of environmental harm. You're right. I think that is ultimately, or not, at least not directly, a human rights violation. I think you're right. There's going to be quite a bit of that. And there's even going to be more countries, even where there either is no domestic or no regional system that can enforce that. But let me take those in turn. I think I'm with the deep ecologists on the question of whether or not environmental harm can happen without impacting humans. I think that ultimately there's an interconnection between all life on this planet. Everything that we've ever known and will know has happened on this one small pale blue dot in the center of in the middle, somewhere in the Milky Way. And I think that's going to be the case for a long time. So I don't accept necessarily that there is such a thing as environmental harm that is completely harmless to humans, though I appreciate that is different to saying that there is no environmental harm that does not violate human rights necessarily. So there is a difference there for sure. But I think if we have a sufficiently broad conception of harm, and if we look at it not just in the immediate, but also in the long-term consequences, I struggle to think of environmental harm that is not harmful to humans on some way, because we're in the same ecosystems as the environment. We rely on the environment in many ways. We are part of the global ecology. So I struggle to see any environmental harm that is beyond trivial that does not harm humans at some point. So that doesn't mean that it will also be a violation of human rights. That's true. So I guess that's an important limitation, which takes me to the next point that you made, which, well, what about these systems where there just isn't respect for human rights domestically, or there is no regional or international agreements in place? Yeah, unfortunately, that's where I need to bite the bullet. The argument just doesn't have anything to say. So the People's Republic of China, for instance, might have its own reasons to go along with the Paris Climate Change Accord and to limit environmental damage and harm for reasons that are their own, but they're not based on human rights from what I can discern. I don't think there is a respect for human rights across the board there, and there's no interest in being perceived to be seen internationally as upholding and respecting human rights. I think the entire project is pretty much rejected, and where that is the case, then my argument has very little to say. They might have their own reasons for doing the right thing when it comes to the environment, but it won't be based on human rights, and that's unfortunate. But that's, I think, the world that we live in. There's few places and few regions across the world where I would say with great confidence that human rights and being seen to comply with them has the value in public policy and discourse that it ought to have. That's unfortunate, but that's not something that I propose to change with the framework. The framework really only works where there is a baseline respect for it, and that's unfortunately how it is. What does this all mean for climate change? I think in the Paris Agreement and in the reports from the IPCC, we have very compelling established standards that are broadly accepted in the relevant scientific community. In other words, I think in terms of my framework, we have established standards. And to the extent that the current legal standards that some states have imposed and others have not fall short of meeting those targets, for instance, the less than 2 degrees target, to that extent, I think the legal standards are either adopted in bad faith and hence don't apply, or the established standards would apply. So I think there's actually a very strong case to say that a state that in its current design of its regulatory framework when it comes to climate change and to mitigation does not follow the established standards that are broadly accepted in the relevant scientific community, we have a violation of human rights, straightforward. So Germany, for instance, until fairly recently, had outlined a target and measures that were pretty much seen universally as being incapable of meeting the 2-degree target. And until that point, I would argue that they were in violation of human rights. Whether they still are is a trickier question because they recently revised their targets and their goals for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But I think that's the conclusion. The United States, in my view, in breach of human rights obligations, and a host of other countries. So yeah, I think that's the short of it. I think that's where the rubber meets the road. I think if you ignore these established standards and the IPCC has given them to us, it's really, really hard to justify how you cannot have measures in place that stay within your allocated carbon budget to meet your Paris obligations. I think that's very difficult to justify. I don't think it's possible. I'll have to think more about the things you said about the precautionary principle and its relationship to emerging standards. I think I see what you're saying, but I don't think I feel ready to comment on that just quite yet. I need to give that some more thought. But thank you so much for all your comments.
Thank you, Stefan. And I would love to continue the discussion. Unfortunately, I'm teaching now at 3 p.m., but it was a real pleasure to hear your comments on my comments. And I look forward perhaps, to meeting and discussing this further. I thank you very much, John, for chairing this meeting impressively well. And I leave you and to continue the discussion on these. But thank you very much again.
Thank you, Tibisay. Thank you very much. I hope your teaching goes well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Stefan, I would invite you, if you can, to maybe give a response to Andrew and my points before we take any questions from the attendees. Can I just remind attendees that they can write their questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, and then I'll get to them if there are any. Okay. Thanks, Stefan.
Great. Thanks, John. Andrew, yeah, thank you so much. I think giving me a lot to think about, especially because I've not been in those rooms, unfortunately. I've not been able to kind of see how this develops, and I don't have the scientific perspective to kind of see. I very much draw on the scientific consensus, and I lean quite heavily on that. But I think what you've kind of allowed me to see through the benefit of your own experiences, that actually that process of agreeing what measures would be suitable, what standards should be upheld, might not be that easy to nail down, even on something that has seemingly been in the public debate, as you say, since the 90s. Effectively, we've had these debates about what the appropriate goals are supposed to be, what are we trying to accomplish when we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and how do we actually go about doing that. And as you know, we may have been able to do that with something that is more contained regionally, geographically, but also in terms of policy options like flood management and flood risk management. But even there, it's as you note, there's quite a bit of a spectrum of possibilities, and it's not clear necessarily how we arrive at certain standards and why we propose certain measures in one area versus other areas, and how we go about doing that in a consistent way that is defensible. So I think it makes me think about how much I'm actually leaning on the scientific consensus, and how far do I actually feel comfortable with taking this. And maybe it is playing a bit too big of a role in me and kind of trying to nail policymakers to a wall and saying, no, this is what you should be doing. But actually underneath the surface, there's quite a bit more discussion and nuance going on that I might be missing that way. So want to think about it. I don't think I can offer more than that at this point. I need to think about this a bit more. It is definitely going to be more difficult with the comprehensive risks that you identify, and yeah, I would be delighted to have a chat with you about how we can kind of take this, compress this argument further into something that is more digestible for the policy side, because that is definitely something that I want to get into a conversation with, because I feel like I could not really get around to doing that much for this book initially, at least. John, yeah, thank you so much for the comments. And I think I totally agree that critical engagement is the highest form of praise that academics have available. So I very much appreciate it. Thank you. So yes, it is definitely anthropocentric, and it is, I would also say, self-consciously anthropocentric in the way that I think I recognize that is the nature of the argument that I'm making. I think we part ways at a certain point, but I kind of want to walk through your points and to kind of make that more clear, I think. So the ECHR jurisprudence, as you say, does show that it can work. It is a feasible framework. I guess where we disagree is whether it goes far enough and whether it meets the important threshold of doing something rather than doing nothing. I guess that's where we would probably have a bit of a debate. So let's start with the anthropocentric focus. I think that is in the nature of a human rights-based approach. I cannot really conceive of a human rights-based approach that would not be anthropocentric. But of course, your objection goes further than that. It's not just that it's anthropocentric, but that anthropocentrism is actually the thing that brought us into this predicament in the first place. It is actually the heart of the problem. And I guess that's where I would push back a bit. I think there's 2 points I would make. The first point is that if I'm with the deep ecologist, and if I'm saying that I find it very difficult to conceive of environmental harm that does not also harm humans along with the rest of the ecosystem, then I think what presents itself as an anthropocentric focus, maybe we should call it an enlightened anthropocentric focus, I'm not sure, but whatever presents itself as an anthropocentric focus may very well actually provide us much more robust safeguards against much broader set of environmental harms than we currently give it credit for, at least at the systemic ecosystem level. I don't think that it is conceivable to fundamentally disrupt an ecosystem and not harm humans. I find that very difficult to see how that would be a sustainable argument to make. That does not address a further concern which you raise, which is the protection of individual non-human animals for their own sake. I think it would be fairly easy for me to make the case that bringing certain species to the brink of extinction is a harm under the environmental minimum that would be actionable, or that should be actionable under human rights law. I think that case I could make. I think it's trickier, and I think that's where sort of the rubber meets the road in our disagreement, is whether that also means that we can actually use that to derive protections for individual non-human animals. Would it also protect the individual great ape as opposed to the species? Would it also protect the individual plant as opposed to the entire species? And that's where I think my quote unquote conservative anthropocentrism kind of comes through a bit, because I find it difficult. Maybe it is possible, but I find it difficult to think of any sort of economic development taking place that does not involve harm to individual species, to individual members of animals or non-human animals. I find that very hard to conceive. I think I'm with you on the morality of factory farming and the way that it shouldn't be happening and should be something we should avoid. And ultimately, we probably need to move away from the crazy levels of meat consumption that are currently prevalent in many parts of the world. But I find it very difficult to see how harm to individual members or parts of certain species is avoidable if we're going to have any level of economic development, which I think is also in its own way a human rights issue. It's part of the whole sustainable development, which we can criticize as trying to bring two things together that really don't fit that well together. But ultimately, I think we need to recognize that there are many humans living under conditions that we in the Western world would never accept, and that they require a certain level of economic development, which entails a certain level of economic harm and degradation. I think the trick for me is, or the tricky part for me is, to how do we balance that appropriately? How do we take the interests of non-human animals into account in this kind of scenario? Because I think they should feature. That being said, I think what I would retreat to ultimately is the position to say, well, the human rights framework addresses those subset of environmental harms that affect humans, and there's nothing stopping regulators, constitutions, and others from protecting non-human animals and species of plant and others more broadly for their own sake. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. And indeed, I think that can be done in a manner that is not just consistent with the human rights framework that I propose, but in some cases might even be required under the human rights framework I propose, at least if we accept that there is no such thing as non-trivial environmental harm and degradation that does not also ultimately harm humans in some way. So I think it is possible to make that work, even though I don't fully develop that claim in the book, because I don't think it is the primary focus of what I was trying to achieve. Some of your other comments, I think I need to think a bit more about, and I think I'm probably going to leave it here. So thank you so much for all the panelists and for all the questions. That was very helpful.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. I don't want to put you on the spot, Andrew. Perhaps you have any contribution that you want to make or response to Stefan's point. If not, we can. If not, I can ask a few more questions on that.
No, I think this has been a great start to hopefully a longer conversation. I mean, it'd be good to talk about the potential policy implications and the process by which different parts of different departments do things, and how these sorts of ideas might filter through. And I certainly wasn't making a huge criticism of your ideas. It was, could this be the umbrella by which we start to look at how different sectors and different risks are dealt with in a consistent way? That doesn't exist in the UK as far as I'm concerned, and I think it should.
Thank you, Andrew. So can I take this opportunity to remind attendees that if they have any questions or comments for Stefan and others, they can put them in the Q&A. And also, I would like to take this opportunity to thank deeply Jolanta, who has been organizing this event for weeks now, if not months, and has been coordinating through the Zoom links that didn't work, the panelists that had to excuse themselves, the chair that wasn't present. So thank you so much, Jolanta, for your incredible work, which is not taken for granted. And also, I'll take this opportunity to remind the attendees that we have another IHSS event next week on Wednesday, where it's another book launch. It's actually a book co-edited by me and 3 other colleagues, former Cambridge colleagues, and we shall be talking about religious freedom and toleration in a historical perspective, not just from a historical perspective, of course, because we have philosophers, lawyers, and theologians involved. So can I please welcome you to have a look at the event and sign up if you haven't already. So before we finish, I'll take this occasion to ask Stefan to perhaps tell us what other directions he's planning for this work. Of course, the book has just come out. He's busy telling people about the content of the book, but how does he propose for this research to be carried forward, if at all?
Thanks, John. Yeah, a couple of things. I think the first thing that I would just want to highlight there is the data set that I compiled is freely available on my ResearchGate profile for anyone who really wants to use it. And I'm happy to talk about the methodology to anyone who wants to try to apply it and develop it further. I think this is really just the first inroad I've made into this type of data analysis. And I think doctrinal work in law specifically can probably benefit quite a bit from actually engaging with data a bit more. I think we're not doing it in a very good way so far. And that's not to say that I've cracked it, but I think there's a good initial step there. So if anyone is interested in that, please reach out to me. I'm very happy to share the data set, and I'm very happy to talk about how you can make it work and adapt it for you and, improve upon the steps that I took. The other one thing that I wanted to quickly address, and this is probably going to be the subject of another paper eventually, is going to be how does this all apply to the UK, especially with respect to climate change? So how should we be thinking about this? So one of the main things that I'm thinking about here, well, do we have legal standards in place now? And I think most likely the answer is no, because the Kyoto Agreement, the Paris Agreement, and also domestic legislation isn't really there. The Paris Agreement, of course, is not legally binding, so there's a bit of a question there as to whether that would even count as a legal standard. But we very much do have, as I mentioned in the response to one of the questions, that we very much do have established standards. We have the IPCC, and we have quite firm ideas about what that means for the carbon budget for any individual country and how they have to behave in order to, what kind of measures are necessary in order to actually conceivably reach that point. So then that brings me to, well, will that actually be enforceable in UK courts? There's a problem here because UK courts traditionally are quite differential when it comes to resource allocation questions. So there's a lot of cases there that would probably be problematic and would have to be overcome in some way. There's also a bit of an obsession, I think, with polycentricity. So this idea that it isn't for courts to adjudicate policy questions with resource implications in particular, again, something that would have to be overcome. There is a bit of an argument potentially to say that, well, actually, if you know that a problem is sort of approaching on the horizon, climate change is approaching in many ways, but also, of course, it's already quite a current problem for policymakers, then not doing everything that you can to avert that might be considered to be unreasonable in the Wednesbury sense. So maybe this is a Wednesbury unreasonableness situation where not taking positive actions might be a problem. There's not a whole lot of case law yet to support that proposition, but that is probably one of the cases I would try to make there. And then, of course, the final question is, even if that all goes through and the UK courts decide, well, yes, this is actually a violation of the rights under the Human Rights Act, then what are we getting? We're getting a declaration of incompatibility potentially, but we're not obviously getting, this is not a court system that is used to being very prescriptive about legislative and regulatory requirements as the German system might be or other systems might be. So the question is, what kind of remedies would be available and would even be desirable in those types of situations? But yeah, anyway, that's going to be the focus for my for the next couple of years. That's the work that's going to come out of this. On the one hand, the data set and trying to spread the word a bit more about data analysis in doctrinal legal work, and the other part of it, trying to think it through for individual countries and specifically in this case, the UK. So yeah, thanks, John.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I before we conclude, I think I would just like to respond to some of the points that you made, especially in relation to how far an anthropocentric approach can lead to the individual protection of non-human animals. And I think that an anthropocentric approach cannot, or can only do so to a certain extent, because as I think you said, many degrees, even light degrees of environmental harm, because of the interconnectedness of humans with the rest of the planet, entails some degree of harm to humans as well. So if we have the coral reef being destroyed and the aquatic population being destroyed, of course, that's a destruction of something that's valuable in itself, especially given that many sentient species will be destroyed in the process. But of course, humans also that live in that environment, that do not have access to the beauty of that environment and the resources actually of that environment will also be harmed. But I think my proposal was a radical shift to not just thinking of the environment and other animals as resources, right? Because so far thinking of them as resources and thinking that economic development means that we need more and more resources, more and more exploitation, the ability for developing countries to go through the same stages, developing in quotes, because it's only material development rather than moral or ethical development as such. The developing countries have to go through that same stages of instrumentalization of nature in order for there to be justice, economic justice. I am not so sure. I think once our view is that the West, and by the West I mean the colonial powers, they have engaged in things that they ought not to, right, and that have led to this problem. Then I think that non-colonial powers can also learn from the mistakes of the colonial powers and try to avoid that. And I guess we just need a different measure than GDP, economic growth, the amount of exploitation, the amount of meat that you're able to eat. That means that you're well. Because of course, the GDP growth comes with certain risks for human well-being, right? And this brings us back to anthropocentrism. So even keeping this anthropocentric focus is deleterious also to humans, right? So there we go. Maybe there is some middle ground, right, to shift our perspective from a anthropocentric one to a less anthropocentric one or non-anthropocentric one for anthropocentric reasons, right? Because of issues of human harm. And another panelist who we have scheduled in the future for an IHSS event is Dr. Jeff Sabo, who's at NYU. He's written a book, Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, and by ourselves he means humans, which I think makes more of the case that I've been advocating of moving beyond anthropocentrism, perhaps even for anthropocentric reasons, right? So perhaps that's our middle ground there. Okay, so Stefan, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you Andrew and Tibisay that left us, and most thanks to our attendees in the audience for participating, and of course the recording of this session will be available on the IHSS website, so many more participants will be able to benefit from this session. So can we all virtually join me in thanking Stefan for his great contribution to the topic?